The Artifact Gallery of Contemporary Art was housed in an old red brick mansion where high ceilings and huge windows created the perfect space for exhibitions. Odette Meredith, the gallery's curator, walked slowly along the wall, meticulously inspecting the layout of the new exhibition. Her slim figure in a slinky black dress reflected in the polished parquet floor. She paused in front of a massive abstract painting, head tilted to the side. Her dark hair, gathered in a careless bun, emphasized the graceful line of her neck. At that moment, Reed Holloway, the newly hired art director, appeared in the room. Tall, with disheveled blonde hair and a sloppy scarf, he was the epitome of a typical bohemian. "I think this work should be moved closer to the center," he said, stopping next to Odette. He smelled of coffee and expensive perfume. "You're probably right," she retorted as she continued to study the painting. "Tomorrow's a big night. Everything has to be perfect." The vernissage did promise to be the event of the season. Blake Meredith, Odette's husband, had invited several of his important clients, people able to purchase works at prices with 5 zeros. As a leading financial advisor to Morgan and Pierce, he had extensive connections among the city's elite. That evening, returning to her and Blake's Upper East Side penthouse, Odette caught her husband at work in the home office. He looked up from his laptop and smiled at his wife. Blake looked impeccable in his 45. The gray on his temples only added to his solidity, and regular gym sessions kept him in great shape. "How are the preparations for tomorrow night?" he asked, leaning back in the leather chair. "All set." Odette perched on the edge of the table. "I hope your guests will appreciate the modern art." "I'm sure they will." Blake drew her to him by the arm. "Especially when it's presented by such a charming curator." The next evening, the gallery glowed. Waiters glided between guests with trays of champagne. Lively discussions about art erupted here and there. Odette, in a long, dark blue dress, moved gracefully from group to group, talking about the works on display. Reed kept in the shadows, observing what was going on. His gaze stopped every now and then on Odette when she was next to her husband. From the outside, they looked like a flawless couple, a successful financier and his exquisite wife, an intellectual and connoisseur of art. By the end of the evening, 3 major works had been sold. Blake patted his wife's shoulder contentedly. "A fine result, my dear. Your gallery is becoming a prominent fixture in town." Odette smiled, but her gaze met Reed's for a moment, and in that brief exchange of glances, something flashed that no one else present noticed. Something that might have ruined this picture of a perfect life. It was past midnight. Blake went to get his car, and Odette stayed late to check the alarm. Her heels drummed on the parquet in the empty gallery. "Gorgeous evening." Reed's voice caught her off guard. He was standing in the doorway, leaning against the jamb. "Yeah, it went great," she replied, trying to speak evenly. "I'll see you tomorrow?" There was clearly another meaning lurking in his question. Odette nodded and hurried to the exit. She got into the car with her waiting husband, and they headed home, a model family returning from a successful social event. Blake Meredith always woke up at 5 a.m. It was a habit developed over years of working on Wall Street. Every morning he took an hour's jog in Central Park, then showered and ate breakfast, while reviewing financial reports on his tablet. By 7:30, his driver was waiting for him. Odette usually woke up later. When she came down to the kitchen this morning, all that remained of her husband's breakfast was the smell of expensive coffee and a folded newspaper. She poured herself some orange juice and walked over to the panoramic window, looking out at a waking Manhattan. Their penthouse on the 32nd floor was the epitome of success antique furniture, collectible wine, artwork on the walls. Blake took pride in every detail of this luxurious nest he'd created for them. He especially loved to show guests his study with rare first editions of classic literature and his whiskey collection. In the evening, they received important guests, Blake's partners from Morgan and Pierce with their wives. Odette watched their housekeeper, Maria, set up the dishes and arrange the utensils. Everything had to be spotless. By 8 o'clock, the guests were gathered in the living room. The men were discussing the latest stock market trends, their wives the newly opened boutique on Fifth Avenue. Odette kept up the small talk, but her thoughts were far away. She was thinking about the new show at the gallery, about Reed suggesting some interesting ideas for the exhibit. "Honey," Blake's voice brought her back to reality. "Tell James about that amazing installation you brought back from Berlin." Odette obediently began the story. She knew her role in this performance: to be the centerpiece of the evening, to maintain the image of a cultured and educated wife of a successful financier. Blake looked at her with pride. His beautiful, intelligent wife fit so well into his idea of an ideal life. At dinner, they served duck with cherries, their chef's specialty. Blake poured a collector's Bordeaux, talking about a recent deal that had brought the company millions. Odette smiled mechanically, but inside she was growing a muffled irritation. This talk of money, these smug men in expensive suits, their wives with perfect styles and empty eyes, it all suddenly seemed unbearably false to her. After the guests left, Blake was in a wonderful mood. He pulled his wife to him. "You were great tonight. James is in awe of your knowledge of modern art." Odette released herself from his embrace. "I'm tired. I'm going to bed." "Of course, dear." Blake didn't notice the coldness in her voice. "I still have work to do. I'll see you in the morning." In the bedroom, Odette stood at the window for a long time. The lights of the night city twinkled below, so alive and full of possibility. And she felt like a bird in a golden cage, where everything was timed by the minute, where every gesture had to meet expectations. Her phone vibrated quietly. A message from Reed. "New artwork is coming in tomorrow. Need your evaluation." She smiled, looking at the screen. The gallery made her feel alive. There, she could be herself, not just Mrs. Meredith, the wife of a successful financier. In the next room, Blake was still working, surrounded by numbers and charts. He was building their future, unaware that the foundation had already cracked. Soon that crack would turn into an abyss, but for now, everything looked perfect, just as life in a golden cage should. It was a rainy spring in New York. Odette spent more and more time at the gallery, often staying late. She attributed it to preparations for a large-scale exhibition of contemporary sculptors, but in fact, she was increasingly attracted by the atmosphere of creative freedom she could breathe in. Reed became her constant companion on these late nights. They could spend hours discussing concepts for future exhibitions, arguing over details and sharing ideas. At such moments, it was as if time stood still and the real world remained somewhere outside the gallery walls. "You know, this sculpture reminds me of your eyes," Reed once said, as they looked at a new work in the dim light of the evening illumination. "Just as mysterious and ambiguous." Odette remained silent, but her heart skipped a beat. They stood very close, almost touching each other with their shoulders. The air between them seemed to be electrified. Blake, meanwhile, was completely absorbed in a new project: the merger of two large investment companies. He came home past midnight, often spent weekends at the office, and over the rare dinner together, talked only about the work. "This is the deal of the decade, honey," he explained when Odette tried to remind him of their vacation plans. "After it's done, we'll be able to afford any vacation we want. Maybe we'll buy that house in France you've been dreaming of." But Odette wasn't sure she wanted a house in France anymore. Her dreams had changed, though she wasn't ready to admit it even to herself yet. One evening, Blake unexpectedly picked up his wife at the gallery. He found her and Reed having a glass of wine surrounded by unpacked paintings. They were sitting on the floor, passionately discussing something and laughing. "I didn't realize discussing art required alcohol," Blake remarked dryly, standing in the doorway. Odette flinched in surprise. We're working on the concept for a new exhibit." "I see." He sounded metallic in his voice. "Why don't you finish it during office hours?" The drive home passed in tense silence, but when they got up to the penthouse, Blake didn't hold back. "What's going on, Odette? You spend all your time at the gallery. I can't remember the last time we had a proper dinner together." "Do you remember the last time you were interested in anything other than your deal?" she parried. "I'm entitled to a professional life, too." "Professional life?" Blake grinned bitterly. "Drinking wine with a young art director, is that what they call it now?" "Don't you dare!" Odette's eyes flashed with anger. "Don't you dare belittle my work. The gallery is the only place I feel alive." "And here you feel what?" He circled his hand around their luxurious living room. "I created all this for you." "Exactly," she interrupted. "You created it. You decided. You chose. Have you ever asked me what I want?" Blake looked at his wife as if seeing her for the first time. "And what is it you want, Odette?" She opened her mouth but couldn't answer, because an honest answer would have frightened them both. "I'm going to bed," she finally uttered. "You probably have work to do, right?" That night they slept in separate rooms for the first time in 5 years of marriage. Odette lay sleepless, staring at the ceiling. Her phone blinked silently, a message from Reed. "Sorry about today. Hope you don't have any problems." She didn't respond, but she didn't delete the message either. In the morning, Blake had left for the office, leaving a note about an important meeting. Everything was back to normal, but something had irrevocably changed. The crack in their perfect marriage had grown deeper, and no amount of money could fill it. That afternoon, Odette arrived at the gallery earlier than usual. Reed was already there, arranging new works. Their gazes met, and they both realized that they had crossed some invisible line, and there was no turning back. Blake Meredith woke up at his usual time of 5 in the morning. He'd stayed up late the night before, going over the deal documents, and now he felt a little dizzy. Odette was sleeping in the next room. She hadn't returned to their shared bedroom since their fight. The morning run had been harder than usual. When he got home, he swallowed a blood pressure pill with orange juice. There was a teapot on the kitchen table, which meant Odette had already left for the gallery. They hadn't seen much of each other lately. The day had been filled with meetings. The deal was being finalized, and the last formalities remained. At 7 in the evening, Blake let the driver go. He'd decided to work from home. In his briefcase was a bottle of collector's whiskey. He planned to celebrate the almost completed project. At 9 o'clock, he felt strange. At first, he put it down to fatigue and the stress of the last few weeks. He poured himself another whiskey, loosened his tie. The numbers were blurring on the laptop screen, and his temples were pounding harder and harder. The last thing he did was text his wife. "We need to talk. I'll be waiting for you at home." The phone slipped from his suddenly weakened fingers. Odette found it at 1 o'clock in the morning. She'd returned late, deliberately staying late at the gallery to avoid the conversation. Blake was sitting in his leather chair, head tilted back. An empty whiskey glass had tipped over onto the table, leaving a dark stain on important papers. Her scream woke the neighbors. The ambulance arrived and pronounced her dead. The preliminary diagnosis was massive heart attack. No one was surprised. Stress, sleep deprivation, high blood pressure, the usual kit of a successful financier. "Mrs. Meredith, you need to calm down." The young policeman handed her a glass of water. "Tell me, when was the last time you spoke to your husband?" Odette sat in the living room, wrapped in a blanket. She was shivering. "I got a text from him, around 9 o'clock. He wanted to talk." "And you only got here now?" "I had an important meeting at the gallery. I didn't think it was urgent." The detective, looking around the office, found nothing suspicious. The desk was the usual clutter of business papers, unfinished whiskey, and blood pressure pills. Blake had obviously worked until the last minute. The laptop was still on. By morning, the body had been taken away. Odette mechanically answered the police's questions. Yes, her husband had a blood pressure problem. Yes, he worked hard. No, he hadn't complained about his health lately. The investigator quickly closed the case. Another Wall Street workaholic burned out on the job, a common story in Manhattan. The coroner's report confirmed natural causes. Odette was impeccable at the funeral. A black dress emphasized her pallor. Dark glasses hid her eyes. Reed stood apart from the main group of mourners. No one noticed how his hands trembled as he threw a handful of earth on the coffin. That evening, a safe in Blake's office was opened. Among the documents was a will made a week before his death. The entire fortune went to Odette, including company stock and real estate. "The signature is properly authenticated," the family attorney reported. "There are no legal impediments to inheritance." Odette nodded, looking out the window of the office where her husband had still recently worked. There was still an overturned glass with a dark whiskey stain on the desk. She was in no hurry to change anything in this room. The private jet landed at Nice Airport in the early morning hours. Odette Meredith, tanned after a week in Sardinia, walked down the ramp. She had not changed much in appearance in 3 years, except that her style had become even more refined, the influence of European fashion. The villa on the Côte d'Azur, bought a year ago, met her with coolness and silence. The housekeeper had prepared everything for the arrival of the mistress, even managed to arrange fresh flowers. Odette tossed her designer bag on the sofa and walked to the panoramic window. The Mediterranean Sea sparkled in the morning sun. Her phone vibrated, a message from Reed. "Back? Need to meet." She set the phone aside without answering. Their relationship had long since lost its former intensity. After Blake's death, things hadn't gone the way they'd envisioned. The artifact gallery had flourished under her management, but Odette had been there less and less. Modern art no longer held the same awe. She preferred to collect classics. Blake's money opened access to the best auction houses in the world. She returned to New York a week later. The penthouse on the Upper East Side had long since changed. No trace of her former life with Blake. Only his office remained untouched, locked, and unlocked. Reed was waiting for her at her favorite restaurant in Soho. He'd aged, his hair showing early gray. The former bohemian charm had been replaced by a tiredness in his eyes. "You've been ignoring my calls," he began without preamble. "I've been busy. Spending Blake's money?" There was bitterness in his voice. "Don't start," Odette beckoned to the waiter. "I don't want to talk about it." "What do you want to talk about? About your travels? About your new paintings? About how you're trying to forget?" "That's enough!" She stood up abruptly. "We had a deal never to revisit the past." That same evening at the Manhattan police station, Detective Sloane Woodward opened an envelope with no return address. The handwriting was intentionally altered, but the text was clear. Blake Meredith's death was not natural. Check on his widow and her lover. Check the insurance. Check blood pressure pills. 3 years is enough time for the truth to come out. Woodward pulled the Meredith case file from the archives. Standard investigation, standard findings. But something about that anonymous letter caught his professional instincts. Meanwhile, Odette sat in the empty penthouse looking out over Manhattan at night. She had achieved everything she dreamed of: freedom, wealth, independence. Why then, did she dream every night of Blake's office and an overturned whiskey glass? The phone vibrated again. "Reed, I'm sorry about tonight. I just can't pretend anymore." She deleted the message without reading it. She had a flight to Paris tomorrow, an impressionist exhibit opening there. A new life required movement, constant motion, so there was no time to look back. At the police station, Detective Woodward began taking his first notes on the Meredith case. He didn't yet know that this investigation would change the lives of many people, including his own. The Manhattan Police Department was in its usual bustle. Detective Sloane Woodward sat at his desk, piled high with papers, rereading the anonymous letter for the umpteenth time. In his 20 years in homicide, he'd learned to trust his intuition. Now it was beeping insistently. Something was wrong with Meredith's case. He looked at the old photos from the scene, the perfectly cleaned office, the overturned glass, Blake dead in his chair, as if asleep over the paperwork. Too perfect. Woodward rubbed his tired eyes and held out the case file to his partner. Detective Peyton Reed, ex-military, sat at a nearby desk, methodically plotting out a schedule of witness interviews. "What do you think?" "It's odd that the widow didn't insist on an autopsy," Peyton remarked, reviewing the paperwork. "With a condition like this, it's common for relatives to demand to check every last detail." "Insurance? $2 million, plus the entire estate in the will," which was made a week before he died. They started by interviewing the servants. The first was the housekeeper, Maria, a full-figured middle-aged woman with a tired face and an attentive gaze. She was nervously rubbing her apron as she sat in an uncomfortable chair in the interrogation room, but she spoke clearly and confidently. "Mr. Meredith came back earlier than usual. Asked me to make dinner, but he never touched it. He worked in the study all the time." "Was Mrs. Meredith at home?" "No. She was often late at the gallery. They've hardly seen each other lately." After the housekeeper, it was the turn of the driver, a tall African-American man in a strict suit. He kept a straight face and answered in military-like brevity. "Boss let me off at 7. Said he wanted to work from home. Looked okay, except a little tired." "Was he on any medication?" Blood pressure pills, regularly. The detectives spent the next few days going over financial records. Since her husband's death, Odette's spending had increased exponentially. Private jets, luxury hotels, beachfront villas. It was as if she was trying to make up for something lost by throwing her husband's money to the wind. "She doesn't look grief-stricken," Peyton observed, looking at another credit card statement. "Check out her entourage, especially that art director, Reed Holloway." When Odette entered the interrogation room, the air seemed to thicken with tension. She looked flawless, a cream dress from a famous designer, a pearl necklace, perfectly styled. Only her fingers nervously rubbing the strap of her purse gave away her condition. "Mrs. Meredith," Woodward began, "we've reopened the investigation into your husband's death." "Why?" Her voice sounded calm, but her knuckles turned white. "New circumstances have come to light. Tell me again about that evening. It's been 3 years. I've already told the police everything. And yet," Woodward stepped forward, "where were you between 9 o'clock at night and 1 o'clock in the morning?" "At the gallery, preparing an important exhibition." "With whom?" A pause. A police helicopter flew by outside the window, its shadow sliding across the table between them. "With Reed Holloway. He's the art director." "Can anyone confirm that?" "What's all this for?" Odette stood up, her heels clattering on the floor. "Blake died of a heart attack. The forensics confirmed it." "Which you didn't demand be done more thoroughly," Peyton remarked. "I was shocked. My husband had just died. And a month later you flew to Paris." Woodward opened a folder of papers. "Then Rome, Barcelona, London. Quite active morning. I don't have to explain how I'm coping with the loss." Odette grabbed her purse. "If you have official questions for me, please contact my attorney." Her footsteps fell silent in the hallway. Woodward walked to the window, looking out at evening Manhattan. The skyscrapers were already turning on their lights, the city preparing for nightlife. "What do you think?" Peyton asked, gathering up his papers. "I think we should talk to Reed Holloway and check out those blood pressure pills. They were destroyed long ago. But the prescriptions must have survived, and the pharmacy records." Woodward went back to the desk and pulled out a new folder. There was a clue here somewhere. He could feel it. And experience told him the worst crimes often hid behind the most perfect facades. Gerald Fisher's office in the pharmaceutical lab was filled with test tubes and flasks. The chemist himself, a short, balding man with glasses, nervously fiddled with a button on his lab coat as the detective settled into chairs across from his paper-cluttered desk. "Mr. Fisher," Woodward placed the bank transfer printouts in front of him. "Explain these payments." "Private counseling," Fisher gulped. "Nothing illegal." $15,000 for consultations about blood pressure medication? Peyton raised an eyebrow. "That's a little pricey." "You don't understand." Fisher took off his glasses and began wiping them with trembling hands. "She wanted to know about the side effects, about the chemical composition, about how the drug could be modified. And you told her?" "I thought it was for research. She said she was writing a paper. And then she brought the pills. Asked me to replace the contents with a modified version. I should have known better. But the money..." Leaving the lab, the detectives got into the car. The windshield wipers measuredly swept raindrops from the windshield. "He'll crack in court," Peyton said confidently. "Guys like that always stab themselves." Meanwhile, their colleagues were keeping surveillance on Odette. She clearly suspected something. She'd visited 3 banks in the last few days, met with a lawyer, booked tickets to Europe. "Preparing to flee," Woodward commented, reviewing the outdoor surveillance reports. They showed up at the artifact gallery in the late afternoon with a search warrant. Reed Holloway, still on his own recognizance, silently opened the safe in the back room for them. "Where are the financial records for the last 3 years?" "In the bottom drawer. She's always been very neat with papers." The ledgers told their own story. There was a black cash register in addition to the official payments. Money for Fisher passed through it, formalized as purchases of materials for the restoration. "Look." Peyton pulled a small box from the far corner of the safe. Inside were blisters of blood pressure pills. "Looks like Blake's original medications." "She kept them as insurance," Woodward nodded, "in case someone started digging." Forensics confirmed These were the real pills prescribed to Blake Meredith. They were replaced with modified ones the day before he died. The lights were on late in the D.A.S office. Woodward and Peyton presented all the evidence they had collected: Holloway's testimony, Fisher's confession, financial records, forensic results. First-degree premeditated murder. The prosecutor slammed the folder shut. I'll sign the arrest warrant. It was past midnight when they received the papers. Woodward glanced at his watch. Odette's flight to Paris was scheduled for 11 a.m. tomorrow. We'll make it, Peyton said, as if reading his mind. On the way to the station, they stopped at an all-night diner. Over cooling coffee, Woodward looked over the case file, plotting the sequence of events. You know what the worst part is? He said suddenly. She planned the whole thing, every little detail, used Holloway, bought Fisher, switched the pills, and almost got away with it. But she didn't. Peyton finished his coffee. We'll finish this case in the morning. The international terminal at JFK never sleeps. At 5 in the morning, the place was already crowded with passengers on early flights. Sleepy tourists with backpacks, business people with laptops, families with children. In this perpetual motion, Odette Meredith stood out like a gem among the pebbles. She stood in line to check in for a New York to Paris flight, elegant in an ivory Chanel suit. Pearl earrings glimmered softly in the cold light of the airport lamps. Flawless makeup hid the traces of a sleepless night. Only the fingers clutching the handle of a crocodile skin suitcase gave away the tension. Detective Sloan Woodward watched her, pretending to study the departure board. He'd seen plenty of killers in his 20 years on the job, but Odette was special. The coolness with which she'd planned her husband's death was both admirable and frightening. Peyton took a position at the counter of the cafe, sipping a cold coffee. 4 plainclothes officers disappeared into the crowd, blocking all possible avenues of retreat. The operation had been calculated to the last detail, just like the crime they had solved. The line moved slowly forward. Odette pulled out her passport and ticket when a woman's voice announced the start of boarding for the flight to Paris. She took a step toward the check-in counter. Going far, Mrs. Meredith? Woodward appeared as if out of nowhere as she held out her papers to the airline clerk. Her hand froze halfway down. Not a single muscle trembled on her flawless face, only her fingers gripped the handle of her Hermes purse tighter. I have an exhibition in Paris, contemporary sculpture. I'm afraid it will have to be postponed. Peyton was already standing behind her back, blocking her escape route. You're under arrest for the murder of Blake Meredith. People around them began to turn around, whispers heard. The clerk behind the counter froze with his mouth open. Odette slowly lowered her hand with the paperwork. Here? At the airport? More annoyance than fear sounded in her voice. How vulgar! The handcuffs clicked quietly on her wrists. Peyton picked up the suitcase, and Woodward carefully took her purse. They led her through the terminal, escorted by curious stares. In the interrogation room, she held herself admirably. Sat up straight, shoulders squared as if she were posing for a society photographer, not under arrest on a murder charge. This is ridiculous. Blake died of a heart attack. You've had 3 years to confirm that. Caused by modified pills, Woodward laid the toxicology report on the table. 15 pages of scientific terms and graphs proving premeditated murder. Gerald Fisher was very detailed in his testimony. A shadow ran across her face, a barely perceptible muscle movement that only an experienced detective could catch. I don't know any Fisher. Really? Peyton spread the bank statements out, fanning out like playing cards. And these payments? $15,000 for killing her husband is pretty thrifty considering the inheritance she received. Odette studied her flawless fingernails. My lawyer. On his way? Woodward nodded. But while we wait, why don't you take a look at these? He pulled out a box of the original pills he'd found in the gallery safe. Why keep your late husband's medicine for 3 years? She was silent. Dawn was breaking outside the window, coloring the dull walls of the interrogation room in soft pink tones, a strange contrast to the grim nature of what was going on. And here's Reed Holloway's testimony, Woodward continued, laying out a new folder. It's an interesting read, especially the part about how you used his feelings. He still loves you, you know? Even after everything you did. Reed. Her voice trembled for the first time in ages. There was a mixture of contempt and some tired tenderness in that name. He's the one who wrote the letter? Of course he did. There's no one else. Why did you do it? Peyton asked quietly. A divorce would have given you half the fortune. You could have left legally. Half? She laughed suddenly, hoarse and mirthless. The laughter reverberated off the walls, turning into some otherworldly sound. You didn't know Blake. He would never let me go. His reputation, his image as the perfect husband. He would have destroyed me, but he wouldn't let me go. And so you destroyed him first. It wasn't hard. She spoke calmly now, almost detachedly, as if she were talking about putting on another exhibition. Reed set me up with Fisher. Poor Reed, he thought we would be together. That we'd run away to Paris, live the bohemian life. So naive. She fixed a disheveled strand of hair and continued. Blake always took his medication before bed. That night he was working late, drinking whiskey. Perfect conditions. You know, he didn't even feel the difference in the pills. Just fell asleep in his chair like he'd done hundreds of times before. And then I was free. For the first time in my life, really free. You know what the funny thing is? When it all worked out, I realized I didn't love Reed. I never had. He was just a tool. Like a paintbrush for a painter, or a hammer for a sculptor. So was Fisher. They were all tools. Blake too. To his father, I was the perfect daughter-in-law. An art historian from a good family, impeccable manners, the right connections. I'd been acting for 15 years. 15 years in a golden cage. Do you have any idea what it's like to be someone else every day? There was a note of passion in her voice, the first real feeling in the entire interrogation. Every dinner, every reception, every damn charity party. Smile, keep the conversation going, be the centerpiece of his life. And in return, what? Unlimited bills? A house I hated? A life on a schedule he made up? A knock on the door interrupted her monologue. The lawyer arrived, a gray-haired man in an expensive suit. While her driver's license was read, Woodward methodically examined the seized purse. Beneath the impeccably arranged cosmetic bag lay an envelope, a one-way ticket, and a passport in the name of Elizabeth Grant with her photograph. You wouldn't have gotten away anyway, he said, showing the find to Odette. All the exits were blocked off. Maybe. She smiled with the edge of her lips. That smile read a strange mixture of defeat and triumph. But the game was worth the candle. 3 years of freedom isn't so little. As she was led away, her heels still tapped confidently on the floor. She walked with her head held high, as if she were on her way to an opera premiere rather than a prison cell. At the door, she turned around one last time. You know, Detective Woodward, sometimes a cage isn't bars or walls. Sometimes it's the bonds we create for ourselves. Blake never realized that, and I understood it all too well. The elevator doors closed behind her. Peyton gathered the papers, organizing them into folders. A perfect murder, he remarked. If it hadn't been for Holloway, if it hadn't been for love, Woodward corrected, looking at the closed elevator doors. She miscalculated everything but the human heart. Even the most brilliant mind can't predict what a man will do when love turns to hate. Outside the window, it had fully dawned. New York City was waking up, starting its normal day. Somewhere in the city, the Artifact Gallery was opening, now without its hostess. At the airport, a plane to Paris was taking off, the same flight Odette had never gotten on. Life went on as usual, indifferent to small human tragedies. In Woodward's office, among the papers and photographs from 3 years ago, lay a fresh morning newspaper. On the front page was a photo of Odette at a social event. Beneath it was the headline, "Socialite arrested on charges of murdering her husband." Another story of how love and hate, greed and fear are woven into a knot that can only be cut in one way. A long trial was beginning, but the outcome was already decided. The perfect crime ceased to be perfect the moment feelings intervened. As is often the case, the most elaborate plan was ruined by simple human nature, the very thing Odette Meredith hadn't considered when planning her path to freedom.